For my sister's big promotion, my parents gave him a Rolex. For my birthday, they mailed a card that said, "Maybe next year you'll make us proud." I didn't reply, just sent them a screenshot of my $1.5 million signing bonus. 3 days later, they begged me to come home for dinner. But I was already dining in Amsterdam. I, 29M, always knew I was the backup child. The realization didn't hit me all at once. It accumulated over years of small disappointments, forgotten achievements, and comparisons that always ended with me on the losing side. But the birthday card was the moment everything crystallized into something I could finally name: indifference. My sister had just made partner at her law firm. 32 years old, sharp as a blade, and everything our parents had ever dreamed of. When the promotion came through, Dad drove 4 hours to hand-deliver a Rolex. Not shipped, hand-delivered. Mom baked her favorite lemon cake from scratch, and they took her to the steakhouse where they'd celebrated their 25th anniversary. I saw the photos on Facebook before anyone bothered to call me. My birthday came 3 weeks later. I was in my apartment in Seattle, building what would become the foundation of my exit from their narrative. The card arrived 2 days late, forwarded from my old address. Inside, Mom's handwriting looped across the generic grocery store design. "Maybe next year you'll make us proud. Love always." No phone call, no cake, no Rolex. I sat with that card for an hour, reading it over and over, waiting to feel something other than the cold clarity that was settling into my bones. The thing about being overlooked your entire life is that you eventually stop expecting anything different. But you never stop hoping. That card killed the hope. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't post a passive-aggressive status or send a hurt message asking why I wasn't worth a phone call. I simply opened my laptop and took a screenshot of the email I'd received that morning from a tech company in Amsterdam. The offer letter detailed my new role as lead AI architect, complete with a signing bonus that made my hands shake when I first read the number: $1.5 million. I sent the screenshot to the family group chat with no caption, no explanation, no emoji, just the image. Then I muted the conversation and went back to packing. The response came faster than any birthday wish had. Dad called 11 times in the first hour. Mom left voicemails that progressed from confused to concerned to almost frantic. My sister sent a text asking if the screenshot was real, followed immediately by congratulations that felt 3 years too late. I let them all go unanswered while I confirmed my flight details and apartment lease in Amsterdam. 3 days after the screenshot, Mom finally tried a different approach. She sent a carefully worded text about how they'd love to have me over for dinner, how they wanted to celebrate properly, how proud they were. Dad followed up an hour later saying he'd pick up stakes and asking what time worked for me. I was already at 30,000 feet, somewhere over the Atlantic, drinking overpriced wine and reading through my relocation documents. I took a photo of my dinner tray, salmon with roasted vegetables, a small chocolate torte for dessert, and sent it to the group chat with a simple caption: "Dining in Amsterdam. Thanks for the birthday wishes." The messages that followed tried to extract some promise of when I'd visit, some reassurance that I wasn't really done with them. I left them on read and ordered another glass of wine. Update 1. Amsterdam was everything I needed it to be. Far enough away that spontaneous visits were impossible, different enough that I could rebuild myself without the weight of their expectations, and busy enough that I could justify my silence as workload rather than intention. The job was intense in the best way. I was leading a team of 12, developing AI systems that would revolutionize logistics for half of Europe. The work consumed me, and I let it. Every algorithm I perfected, every presentation I nailed, every compliment from my CEO felt like evidence I was collecting for a trial that would never happen. I was proving something to people who weren't even watching anymore. 2 months in, Mom started sending weekly emails. They were chatty and mundane, filled with updates about the neighborhood and questions about my life that felt rehearsed. I responded every third or fourth one with brief, polite answers that revealed nothing. When she asked about visiting, I told her my schedule was unpredictable. When she asked about video calls, I blamed the time difference. Dad took a more direct approach. He called one Saturday morning, Friday night for him, and I made the mistake of answering. He asked about my work, and I gave him the same generic overview I'd given to acquaintances. He asked about my apartment, and I described it in terms that could have fit any rental in any city. Then he got to the point. He said they'd been thinking about the birthday card, about how it might have come across wrong. He said they were proud of me, that they'd always been proud, that maybe they just hadn't known how to show it with me the way they did with my sister. I let the silence stretch long enough that he asked if I was still there. I told him I was, but that I had a meeting in 20 minutes. He asked when I'd come home to visit. I told him I'd let him know and ended the call before he could push further. The truth was, I had no intention of going back. Not for holidays, not for birthdays, not for the inevitable guilt trips that I could already see forming on the horizon. I'd spent 29 years being the son who wasn't quite enough, and I was done auditioning for a role that had already been cast. My sister tried a different strategy. She sent a long text message apologizing for not recognizing how differently we'd been treated. She said she'd been so focused on her own achievements that she hadn't noticed the disparity. She said she wanted to fix things, to be better, to actually be the sister I deserved. The message felt sincere enough that I almost responded with something real. Instead, I sent back a thumbs-up emoji and changed the subject when she followed up. Work accelerated. My team delivered ahead of schedule, and the company rewarded us with bonuses and expanded responsibilities. I bought a better apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a canal. I dated a woman from Norway for 6 weeks before we mutually agreed we were both too focused on our careers. I learned Dutch slowly and badly, but enough to order coffee and complain about the weather. I built a life that had nothing to do with being someone's disappointing son. Update 2. The first major holiday without me was Thanksgiving. Mom called the week before to ask about my plans, and I told her I'd be working through it since it wasn't a holiday in the Netherlands. This was technically true, though I'd been invited to an expat gathering that I planned to attend. She sounded hurt, but didn't push. Dad sent a text saying the table would feel empty without me. My sister posted a family photo to Instagram with a caption about gratitude that conspicuously didn't mention my absence. I spent Thanksgiving eating Indonesian food with a group of American and Canadian engineers while we complained about European business hours and praised the bike infrastructure. Someone asked about my family, and I said they were in California and I'd see them eventually. It was the first time I'd lied about it, and it felt easier than I'd expected. Christmas brought more pressure. Mom sent a package with homemade cookies and an ornament from my childhood that I vaguely remembered. The note inside said they missed me and hoped I'd consider coming home for the holidays. Dad called to offer to pay for the flight, which might have been touching if it hadn't taken 6 months of silence for him to make the gesture. My sister sent a video message of her kids asking where I was, which was manipulative enough that I respected the strategy even as I deleted it. I told them I couldn't get time off work, which was a lie I justified by reasoning that I could have gotten the time off, but chose not to request it. I spent Christmas Day hiking through the Dutch countryside with coworkers, then attending a dinner party where no one knew my family and no one asked why I wasn't with them. The new year brought a promotion. Director of AI Innovation, with a salary that made my signing bonus look modest. I posted about it on LinkedIn with a professional photo and a caption thanking my team. Mom commented with a string of heart emojis. Dad shared it with a caption about his brilliant son. My sister called it inspiring. I didn't respond to any of them. The turning point came in February. My company was flying me to San Francisco for a conference, which meant I'd be 3 hours from my parents for the first time since leaving. Mom found out through LinkedIn's location tags on my conference posts and immediately started planning. She texted asking which days I'd be free, what restaurants I liked now, whether I wanted them to drive up, or if I'd prefer to come down. The presumption that I'd see them at all irritated me more than I'd anticipated. I told her my schedule was completely packed with conference obligations and networking events. This was partially true. The conference was demanding, but I also scheduled every meal and evening deliberately to avoid gaps they could fill. She asked about breakfast before my flight out. I said I had an early departure. She asked about coffee between sessions. I said the sessions ran back to back. She finally asked directly when I was planning to see them. I told her I wasn't. The phone call that followed lasted 47 minutes. Mom cried. Dad took over and demanded to know what they'd done wrong. My sister conference called in and tried to mediate. I let them exhaust themselves with explanations and excuses and promises that things would be different. When they finally ran out of words, I spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. I reminded them about the birthday card, about the Rolex they drove 4 hours to deliver to my sister while I got a forwarded card that suggested I was a disappointment, about every graduation where they'd left early, about every achievement they'd minimized, about 29 years of being the son who had to prove himself while my sister simply had to exist. Dad tried to interrupt, to explain that they'd never meant it that way. I told him intent didn't matter when the impact was a lifetime of feeling inadequate. Mom said they'd been proud of me all along. I asked why they'd waited until I was successful enough to ignore them to mention it. My sister said she tried to apologize. I pointed out that apologizing for not noticing discrimination makes you complicit in it. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Finally, Dad asked what I wanted from them. I told him I wanted nothing, which was the truth. I didn't want apologies or explanations or promises of change. I didn't want dinners or visits or carefully staged reconciliations. I wanted exactly what I'd built, a life where their approval was irrelevant. Mom asked if I'd ever forgive them. I told her there was nothing to forgive because I'd stopped caring enough to hold a grudge. That seemed to hurt worse than anger would have. I ended the call and blocked the conference number. Then I went to a networking dinner where a VP from Microsoft told me I was the most impressive young architect she'd met in a decade. I went back to my hotel and slept better than I had in months. Update 3. The conference ended and I returned to Amsterdam without seeing them. The emails that followed were desperate in ways that might have moved me a year earlier. Mom wrote essays about her regrets and promises to do better. Dad sent articles about estranged families and how to rebuild relationships. My sister offered to fly out to Amsterdam to talk in person, which I declined without explanation. I didn't block them entirely. That felt performative, but I let their messages accumulate unread. Every few weeks I'd skim through them, looking for anything that suggested they understood why I'd left rather than just that I'd left. Nothing ever rose to that level. They were sorry I was hurt. They wanted to fix things. They missed me. But none of them seemed to grasp that you can't fix 29 years of conditional love with a few months of guilty outreach. My life continued without them. I became known in the AI ethics community for research on algorithmic bias. I spoke at conferences in Berlin and Tokyo. I dated a Belgian woman who worked in sustainable architecture and who never asked why I didn't visit my family, because she assumed everyone had their reasons. I bought art for my apartment and learned to cook Indonesian food and became a regular at a jazz club in Jordan. A year after the screenshot, my team launched the project that would define my career. The system we'd built reduced logistics costs by 30% while cutting carbon emissions by 40%. The company went public 3 months later, and my equity made me wealthier than I'd ever imagined. Forbes did a profile. TechCrunch called me a rising star. The Dutch government gave me an innovation award. Mom sent a congratulations email that I'm certain she workshopped for days. Dad left a voicemail that tried to sound casual while conveying how impressed he was. My sister posted on Facebook about her brilliant brother, tagging me in a post I didn't acknowledge. They were proud now that there were articles and awards and public validation. I thought about responding with something cutting about how their pride was contingent on external recognition. Instead, I did something worse. I simply didn't respond at all. Their pride meant nothing because they meant nothing. They'd become strangers whose opinions held the same weight as any random person commenting on my LinkedIn posts. The second year brought more of the same. They tried new approaches, asking about my work without pushing for visits, sending gifts for holidays without demanding acknowledgement, inviting me to family events without expectation that I'd attend. It was all too late and too calculated. They were treating me like a project with steps and strategies rather than a son they'd failed to value. What finally changed things wasn't a grand gesture or a perfect apology. It was my sister's wedding. The invitation arrived 6 months in advance, expensive cardstock with embossed lettering. She was marrying another lawyer, someone appropriately impressive who fit perfectly into the narrative our parents had always wanted for her. The invitation included a handwritten note saying she understood if I couldn't come, but that she hoped I would because I was her brother and she missed me. I threw it away immediately. Then I pulled it back out of the trash an hour later. Then I threw it away again. The truth was that I missed her too. Not the golden child she'd been in our parents' eyes, but the actual person underneath that role. We'd been close as kids before the comparison started. She'd taught me to ride a bike. I'd helped her with calculus. Somewhere in the years of unequal treatment, I'd let myself forget that she was also trapped in the dynamic our parents had created, just on the other side of it. 3 months before the wedding, I sent her a text asking if we could talk. She called within 5 minutes. We talked for 3 hours, avoiding our parents entirely and just remembering who we'd been before we became the favorite and the forgotten. She asked if I'd consider coming to the wedding. I told her I'd think about it. 2 weeks before the wedding, I booked a flight. I didn't tell anyone except her. I arranged to arrive the day of and leave the morning after. I made it clear I wasn't there for a family reunion or a reconciliation. I was there for her because she'd actually put in the work to understand what she'd been complicit in and change it. The wedding was in wine country, scenic and expensive, and exactly what my parents would have wanted. I arrived just before the ceremony and sat in the back. Mom spotted me during the processional and audibly gasped. Dad turned around and stared. I kept my eyes on my sister, who smiled when she saw me in a way that made the trip worth it. The ceremony was beautiful. The reception was uncomfortable. My parents approached me immediately, both trying to hug me at once. I stepped back and kept the conversation brief. Yes, I was doing well. Yes, I was still in Amsterdam. No, I wasn't staying long. They tried to extend it, to ask about dinner later or breakfast tomorrow or when I'd visit next. I told them I had an early flight and needed to spend time with the bride. My sister and I danced once, her in her ridiculous wedding dress and me in a suit I'd bought in Rotterdam. She thanked me for coming. I told her I was proud of her, and I meant it in a way our parents never seemed to manage with me. She asked if I'd ever come back for real. I told her I didn't know, but that I'd stay in touch with her at least. I left before the cake was cut, catching a ride to a hotel near the airport. My phone filled with messages from my parents asking where I'd gone, saying we needed to talk, asking if I'd really flown across the Atlantic just to leave after 3 hours. I silenced the notifications and slept. The flight back to Amsterdam felt like closing a chapter. I'd proven to myself that I could show up for the people who deserved it while still maintaining boundaries with those who didn't. My parents had spent 2 years trying to fix what they'd broken, but they'd never understood that some things can't be repaired. They can only be accepted as broken and moved past. 6 months after the wedding, I started dating someone seriously for the first time since moving. She was French, worked in international development, and had a complicated relationship with her own family that meant she understood why I didn't talk to mine much. When she asked about them eventually, I gave her the simple version. We weren't close because I'd spent my life not being enough, and by the time I was, I'd stopped caring about their opinion. She asked if I thought I'd ever forgive them. I told her the same thing I'd told my mother 2 years earlier. There was nothing to forgive because you can't miss what you never really had. My parents still send occasional messages, birthday wishes and holiday cards, and links to articles they think I'd find interesting. I respond sometimes with brief acknowledgments that give them nothing to build on. My sister and I video call monthly, and she's careful never to pressure me about the family. She gets it now, or at least she gets it enough. 3 years after the screenshot, my company opened a San Francisco office and offered me a position leading the U.S. expansion. I turned it down without hesitation. My life was in Amsterdam, built deliberately far from the people who'd made me feel small. I had friends who chose me without requiring proof of worth. I had work that challenged me without needing external validation. I had finally become the person I wanted to be, and that person didn't need his parents' approval to know his own value. The Rolex sits in my sister's jewelry box, apparently too nice to wear regularly. My birthday card is somewhere in a landfill, dissolved into nothing like the relationship it represented. And I'm here, in a city that never knew me as the disappointment son, living a life that was worth more than any amount of delayed recognition. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. Sometimes the best revenge is simply building something better on the other side of the burn.